What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another Salt and Pauper Saturday video. And today we're going to continue our look at red, specifically name sticker Goblin. But today we're going to talk about things a little bit differently. Instead of showing you how to play the deck and what the deck can do, we're going to talk about how you should be targeting this deck and how to beat it and increase your win rate against decks playing it. So let's take a look at the main culprit, Koldatha Red or Goblin Red, that has sprung up as the new best-in-class red aggro deck utilizing the new name sticker Goblin. So let's jump into the deck tech and let's identify some of the key interaction points, some of the potentially best cards to be running in your main board if you expect to see this deck, and what the worst matchups for this deck are so that you know what decks to consider bringing to your local tournaments so that you have the best chance to beat it. Okay, so here we are with my deck list from last week's video. If you haven't seen that video, I highly encourage you to go check it out. This deck is incredibly explosive, and you have some crazy game states that can come from this. But in general, the power of this deck relies on that 3-drop that you can see right up here. Name Sticker Goblin has given this deck incredible explosive potential on a 3-drop. Now, there are several points to be aware of in this deck where you can try to target them and run them out of resources or just outright gas them out. Specifically with Name Sticker Goblin, if you're aware of the trigger, you can interact with it. So with Name Sticker Goblin, specifically when it enters the battlefield, if it entered from anywhere other than the graveyard or exile, and it's on the battlefield, and you control 9 or fewer creatures named Name Sticker Goblin, you roll a 20-sided die, and you gain mana back. Now, that second part, if it's on the battlefield and you control 9 or fewer, is a checks on resolution ability, which means that if you kill this goblin in response to its trigger, they do not get the mana back. Now, this functions very similarly to the paper version, where if you respond to the trigger to put a name sticker on the card, they do not get the mana for the ability resolving. This is a very, very important interaction point to be aware of, since most people do not know that you deny them the mana if you kill the goblin in response. So be aware that is a very, very important factor here. Denying them the mana for that explosive combo turn can really, really impact the ability to steal games with this deck. You are still fighting just a regular Koldatha Red deck at that point, so you need to be prepared for that matchup. But it's much easier to beat a regular Koldatha Red deck than a deck that can swing for upwards of 28 damage on turn 3 with haste. So killing the Name Sticker Goblin is your primary objective. You can do that through several different variations. Obviously, if you're in the red deck as well, Lightning Bolts against the Name Sticker Goblin is very impactful. If you're on anything running black, you can obviously just cast down or snuff out in response. Even a Defile out of the Gardens list, if you're running the Defile version, would be a perfectly reasonable response to this. But otherwise, countering the card is also an option, obviously. If it never resolves, they never get the mana. So fighting them on Name Sticker Goblin on turn 3 can be a very specific interaction point that you should be aware of. And you should definitely be leaving mana open on turn 3 to make them play around it. Often in my games last week, if you'll notice, my opponents were usually tapping out on turn 3, which gave me the all clear to just full commit, and that allowed me to build some absolutely insane board states. Now, obviously, they're not going to have Goblin on 3 in every single game, so you need to be aware of what you're going to do with that mana if you leave it open and they don't have something. So instant speed interaction or instant speed cantrips, draw spells, other value spells like Rowan's Grim Search or Opt, Mental Note, all of the instant speed cantrips and things like that are going to be very, very important going forward in the meta, because you're going to need to do something with that mana so it's not just dead and losing you tempo. Looking at the rest of the deck, it is a pretty standard Koldatha Red deck. Some of them are running 3 Galvanic Blasts in this Chain Lightning slot. Others are running just the Chain Lightnings. You've got your Synthesizers, your Rebirths, your Bolts. your bushwhackers, epicures, swift spears, and then a full 8 of the impulses. Now the impulses are the other key point to be aware of in this deck. Without them, the deck does tend to run dry very quickly. It doesn't have a ton of sticking power, and the individual cards themselves don't have a ton of power outside of Swift Spear, Bushwhacker, and Namesticker Goblin. So card for card, the card quality of this deck is fairly low, but they just get so many of them. They just keep drawing and keep going deep and keep going deep. And normally, the counter strategy would be to allow them to draw and then counter the payoff, but that's actually counterintuitive in this deck. You want to stop the train as soon as you can. So countering the impulse here isn't a bad option. Lastly, the deck's primary kill condition with this Bushwhacker is utilizing a whole bunch of creatures and going wide on a whole bunch of 1-drops. So very important cards to be aware of against this deck are obviously things like Suffocating Fumes, Breath Weapon, Fiery Cannonade, but additionally, you can bring back the old staple of Clark Clan Shaman. This deck has a very difficult time. You can see it only has about 7 removal spells for creatures in the main board. Very difficult time dealing with a threat of activation effect like a Crypt Rats or a Clark Clan Shaman. Now, obviously, Crypt Rats is a 3-drop, so having it available to crack with mana available on turn 3 is going to be difficult, but be aware that that threat of activation ability or Clark Clan Shaman's threat of activation with a couple artifact lands or a couple, like a Blood Fountain and a Blood Token or something, is very, very impactful against this deck because it completely prevents the Swarm turn. Additional options for those instant speed responses we were talking about to make sure your mana isn't dead. Suffocating Fumes is an absolutely great option against this deck. Not only does it reduce the damage of anything that survives, but it kills all of the Goblin tokens and most of the 1-drop creatures, as well as all of the remaining Epicures, Bushwhackers, and anything else that's swinging at you. And then if they don't have the combo turn, if you have another one, or if you really need to draw into some additional cards, you can just cycle it. So it's a really good option. Secondarily, you have things like Fog. I mean, Moment's Peace and Prismatic Strands are still very popular. Moment's Peace a little bit less so, but things like Turbo Fog are going to be good against this deck. It's just unavoidable, and it's very, very difficult for them to eke out a victory against things like Moment's Peace, Tangle, Weather the Storm. Those are really going to buy you a lot of time. But additionally, Prismatic Strands, you'll see that a large percentage of the sideboard here in Red Elemental Blasts, as well as Makeshift Munitions and Flaring Pains, are dedicated to stopping decks from stalling them out with Prismatic Strands and things of that nature. So obviously those cards are going to be valuable here. Bad matchups for this deck are fairly limited, but you have the old Grixis Affinity build or a very heavy Clark Clan Shaman variant of the Grixis Affinity build. Turbo Fog obviously is going to be very powerful. And then Kagates is another very good deck. The deck is just packed with life gain, interaction, counterspells, and Prismatic Strands, and that's very difficult for this deck to overcome. But ultimately, guys, there are several ways to target this card and target this deck in general. At the end of the day, it is just a red deck, so run your blue Elemental Blasts and have a heyday hunting down this deck. One of the easiest ways for those who wonder how I target decks or how I identify weaknesses in decks is to look at the sideboard. If you'll look here, the deck has End the Festivities for the mirror match. Obviously, the red deck has the built-in answers in those Chain Lightnings to deal with the Namesticker Goblins. It can go wide, so it can block its own Goblin tokens. You know, it's just going to be a matter of draw order and sequencing properly. So having a mirror match is correct and easy enough to play through as long as you know the interaction points and your opponent maybe doesn't, or doesn't sequence their draws or turn order quite well. Red Elemental Blast obviously coming in against the blue decks. Delver decks are everywhere right now. This one is less of a weakness and more of a increasing a matchup that you're likely to see a lot of. So I don't necessarily count Delver as a bad matchup for this deck. It's just going to be one of the primary competitions. Seal of Fire is in here for the Ninfinity deck, or the white, blue, all that glitters affinity aggro deck. That deck can beat this deck very, very quickly. However, that deck tends to end the game a turn after this deck. So again, I don't count it as a weakness. I just count it as something that you're likely to play against a lot. So we do have Seal of Fire. Seal of Fire doubles as a way to interact with opponent's Swift Spears. So again, a little bit of dual coverage there for the mirror match as well. Flaring Pain is really the identifier of the weaknesses of this deck. Flaring Pain as a full 3 of in the sideboard is a lot of Flaring Pains. Most deck running Flaring Pains in the past would only run a maximum of 2. Running 3 really shows that this deck does not want to see fogs, does not want to see prismatic strands, it does not want to see protections. That's really where I identify the primary weakness of this deck. And then Makeshift Munitions being a dedicated answer to Coggates really draws my eye to that deck as one of the better matchups in this case. Obviously, Affinity still has a good matchup as long as you're running mainboard Clark Clan Shamans, and Turbo Fog's going to be difficult, but Coggate really does feel like the deck to be right now. I like that you can run Prismatic Strands as well as several other either protection spells, interaction spells, counter spells. Spell Pierce is absolutely fantastic in this matchup, although it doesn't seem like it would be, but on turn 2, if they tap out for an impulse and you have a Spell Pierce, it's very, very difficult for them to start to generate the momentum again. So ultimately, guys, I hope this helps you target the deck, identify where you want to be spending your resources when you're in this matchup, and hopefully it helps you prepare to face the Red Menace, the Goblin Kuldotha aggro decks that are sure to be in your leagues going forward. Now, some other decks are running this card as well. You'll see this deck, or you'll see this name sticker Goblin showing up in Turbo Initiative as well. Now, Turbo Initiative is an entirely different deck. It's an entirely different matchup. If you're interested in me creating a Beat the Meta version for the Turbo Initiative deck, I am happy to. Let me know down in the comments below if you want to see that episode of Beating the Meta. And ultimately, it holds the same weakness as this deck in that if you kill the Goblin, you generally fizzle out the turn. So just be aware of how that interaction works with the trigger on the stack. Make sure you're not missing your chance to deprive them of the mana refund from the Goblin. That's going to do a lot of heavy lifting in the future as we go. Anyway, guys, hopefully this helps. I've noticed several opponents in last week's videos and games did not know the interaction to kill the Goblin to deprive the mana. And after playing it in paper a couple of weeks, I've noticed the same. So I really wanted to make this video, empower you guys on how to and when to kill this Goblin, when to fight the deck on resources, and I hope this helps. So thank you so much for watching through the video today. As usual, guys, goodbye forever, and I'll see you next time.